What's up, everybody? It's Charles. Today I'm going to be taking your questions on misfueling a diesel, transmission issues on a DSG, stalling on a Mark III, and more. This is episode 243 of the HumbleMechanic podcast. Remember, to get a question on a show like this, be sure to email me, charles@humblemechanic.com. Put question for Charles in that subject line. Ask the question right at the top. Give me some space, then all the details of the question. Helps me out so much when actually answering them. Also, if you don't see your question on a show like this, be sure to hit that quick videos playlist on YouTube where I do one question per video. In addition to that, there are audio-only versions of this video as well as many other ones on iTunes, Stitcher, Google, or of course over at HumbleMechanic.com. All right, let's talk about the sponsor of the day, which is CRP Automotive. CRP deals in a ton of OE maintenance and repair parts, timing belt kits, suspension components, and even fluids. In fact, they make the factory DSG fluid for Volkswagen and Audi. So check them out at crpautomotive.com. And also remember, there is a premium membership. You guys get amazing discounts, downloads of VW Audi training manuals that I write for my classes I teach, and a whole bunch more stuff. Links down in the description as always. That's wrapped up. Let's hit these questions. First one up is from Rob. A good friend of mine brought me his '02 Mark IV TDI Jetta, an ALH 5-speed, to repair. He confessed he accidentally filled the tank with gasoline. Then, not aware of his mistake, he ran it until the engine wouldn't start. I haven't done a ton of diesel work, but I have serviced this car before: fuel filter, throttle body cleanout, oil change, and more. It's a nice car. He's done some of the work to it, and I'd really hate to see it parted out. Before tearing into this thing, is there anything easy to check that's a dead giveaway that the engine or fuel system is not salvageable? All right, so Rob, I've ran into this before many times on many generations of diesels. On the ALH that you're dealing with, odds are, right, this could go anyway, but odds are, if you remove that gasoline, you flush any gasoline out of the lines from the tank up to under the hood, you replace the fuel filter and properly prime it with diesel fuel, or ATF works really well for this too. You get any fuel out of the high pressure pump or the injection pump on that car. You get any gasoline out of the lines and out of the injectors, you're probably gonna be okay. I've never seen gasoline contamination cause catastrophic failure on an ALH or on a pump deuce like I have on the common rails, that newest generation CJAA and other engine codes. Those are so sensitive with the high pressure pump that they use that really VW says like 1% gasoline can cause damage to that pump. I've never tested that theory, but I've seen a lot of those come apart. Some due to pump failure, some due to misfueling, others due to, well, who knows, right? So here's what I would do though, maybe before I went to all the trouble to pull out all that gasoline, because you guys know it was almost empty and they filled it all the way to full, because that's just how it happens almost every time, right? That's how it's happened. It was almost empty, filled all the way full with gasoline. I would disconnect the line to the injection pump that comes from the fuel filter, and I would try to run the car off of clean, fresh diesel fuel. That pump in the tank is not actually a pump. It's more of a delivery unit. There's no electronics that actually pump fuel. The fuel is pulled by the injection pump. So all you really need to do on that one, I mean, for real, this couldn't be easier, is get a cup of fuel, take the line off, put it in the fuel, and then crank the car. It'll probably crank forever as you get that gasoline out. It might be worth cracking the lines open on the injectors to help get that gasoline out faster. But you want to see if it's going to run. And that's going to tell you whether there was damage to that injection pump or not. Again, I've never seen that pump fail because it was contaminated with gasoline. I've seen that pump fail before, but never for that reason. So I would try and flush the gasoline from the injection pump, lines, injectors out first. And then if everything's okay and you can fire the car up and it'll probably run like crap for a few minutes. I've heard of guys running that diesel purge stuff from Liqui Moly, I think, and having good results with that too. But I would run something, get at least fresh, clean diesel fuel, see how the car runs, see how it idles, make sure it revs up and that kind of thing. And then if that's cool, then I would work my way back. The reason I'm saying that is I would hate for you to spend all that time and energy to deal with all the gasoline, getting it all out of the tank. Come to find out it needs a $1,500 injection pump or whatever the price of those are today, plus injectors, and now you're stuck with a really expensive parts that you've already spent a ton of time on the car with. So do it in that order. Get it running first off, just a clean source of diesel fuel. Honestly, Even if you buy a 1-gallon gas can, fill it with diesel and stick the hose in there, that's perfectly fine. Of course, you're probably not going to drive the car that way, but it's perfectly fine for testing in the bay. And odds are you're going to be just fine. Your buddy's going to be just fine. It's just going to be work to get all that fuel out of it. And hey, if it was straight gasoline, you'd probably put it in an older car and it'll run just fine. All right, next one up is from Kenneth. I used a reputable mechanic in the industry and had a project car. A huge dream, but I didn't financially have the funds on hand, so I let him know it would take a while. He was all on board to help. I wasn't educated mechanically enough to know how much I got screwed until later. Long story short, my engine had given up one day, so he dismantled it, telling me the block was bad. I was adamant I would take the block so I could repurpose it. Never did he attempt to give it back or acknowledge it. Also, when I pulled my car from the shop, I never got the flywheel or clutch. Is this lower down on the list of horror stories you've heard? Took the fire out of my dream of having a 500 horsepower street car. Unfortunately, had to sell the car and the next person got a steal, but it's still gonna have to spend some money to get it back on the road. Okay, so I feel like there's probably way more to this story, Kenneth, than I got, but again, long story short, right? So let's talk about the side of you had this project car and some stuff happened, right? Guys, things like this often happen. And and what I mean by that is, like, let's say you bring your car to me and it needs a transmission, right? Whatever the part is, you fill in your own if you don't like the transmission. It needs a transmission. And I say, okay, we're going to put a new transmission in it. I order transmission, I get transmission, I install, car goes down the road. 99% of the jobs are like that, whether it's an air filter or wiper blades or transmission or engine. Customer doesn't care about the part. Personally, I think this is a mistake and you should always look at the old parts, but that's for another time. You asked for the engine block and the clutch and flywheel, right? Or the bottom end, whatever it was. Let's keep it to the engine block and we'll get to the flywheel in a second. You asked to get this back and that didn't happen. There's a number of reasons why this may be. First of all, it may never have been communicated to the actual technician working on your car. Typically in a shop, especially that's more than just like 3 people, you have an advisor and you have a technician. All the customer interaction is with the advisor for the most part, and then advisor interacts with technician. The loss of communication between the customer and the technician can be huge. I have seen it go insanely bad, right? Where that main point the customer was trying to make with the advisor never got from customer advisor to technician. It's like that old game telephone where, you know, by the end of the line, it was a totally different sentence than it started with. And that sucks and that happens, and I hate that you didn't get the parts you want back. There's also the opportunity for technician shop to do something kind of nefarious with it. I don't know what they would do with an old engine block other than maybe recycle it. Maybe they're selling it out the back door. I don't know. That to me is like way down on the list that they would actively seek out doing something wrong with this engine block, unless it's some ultra rare, insanely expensive part. Then, you know, who knows what was happening. Odds are what happened is that you did have a bad block, and what maybe they did was use your long block engine, right, cylinder head and bottom end, as a core charge. Maybe they got a junkyard engine, brought it in, and the yard or whatever, the salvage company wanted that engine back so they could scrap it out. My guess is that's probably what happened with it, is that it had to go back for a core charge. This is a lot of times applicable with flywheels, may or may not be with clutch. The only way really to know is to just talk to the shop. And a lot of times with stuff like this, like, hey, I want my old parts back, you really need to get them right away, right? You can't ask that shop to say, hey, and Kenneth, I'm not picking on you or saying this is what you did. You can't ask that shop, hey, I want my parts, and then leave them there for 5 months and expect them just to trip over it all day, right? At some point, the shop's got to get cleaned and that stuff's got to get recycled. So my guess is that's probably what happened. Now, again, this could have went way the other way. I'm not making excuses for any shop, but more times I've seen it just be kind of like a misunderstanding rather than I'm stealing this engine block that's bad from this customer. There's probably a reason why they didn't give it back to you. Again, as I've said it a million times, lack of communication between all parties in the industry is one of the biggest problems in the industry, because customer and technician don't understand each other. Advisor does their best sometimes they're terrible. You know, there's good advisors, there's great advisors, and there's some that aren't fit to drive an iPad. It's just a lack of communication is huge in the industry, and really one of the main sources for a lot of the really big problems that the automotive industry has. As far as project cars go, guys, project cars are just bleeding money machines. Even if you think, hey, I got a $10,000 budget for this build, it's probably not going to be enough, because I guarantee you there's going to be things you forgot about. So I really caution you, especially if you're paying someone else to do the project, don't start the project until you have a plan or have the funds to finish it quickly. The longer that car stays at the shop, the longer it's between payments, the longer it's delayed, the less the shop's going to want to work on it, and the less that's going to happen for you, the less motivated you're going to be. It's just like doing a project car at home, but you got someone waiting for you to pay them, right? And not paying someone is a good motivator for them not to do any work. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think you really got taken advantage of or ripped off in the way that it probably does feel like you did. At least it wasn't intentional. But you really do have to jump on that. If you want those parts, you need to get them right away. Not making excuses for that shop, but I've seen these kind of things happen, and that's just a piece of advice from me to you as a customer. Get that stuff right away, and then you don't have to worry about it going out the door. Oh, and one other thing. Yes, you are always going to feel like you gave your project car away because you've spent so much money and energy on it, and the person that buys it doesn't care about that. It's actually a great way, and a lot of times, to get the start of a project car is to buy one that somebody else didn't finish, and you're going to save a ton of money because you know they spent the big bucks right up front. Typically, it's the details that they don't finish up, and that's where you can capitalize and score an awesome deal on a project car. All right, next one up is from Alistair from South Africa. That's so cool. I have a 98 Golf 3 VR6 with a stalling issue. It's my daily driver with 345,000 kilometers on the clock and the first engine, and there's never been engine work. Drives great, but sometimes, especially when it's hot, but not only when it's hot, when engaging the clutch, when coming to a stop, the revs will sometimes drop to about 300, then come back to 800. It will stall, but start right back up. Using my OBD11, I got two codes, 00515, which is like a cam position code, and 00553, which I think is an airflow meter code maybe. Both are intermittent, but will keep coming back if I clear the faults. Recently replaced the airflow sensor, O2 sensor, fuel pump, battery, coil pack, spark plug leads. Running out of ideas. What could the problem be? My first thought is, first of all, thanks for the question. It's so cool coming from another part of the world. My first thought is that barrel connector right by the secondary coolant pump, the after-run coolant pump. I have seen those just, that happened to me on my Cabrio. I was down here close to the house, got on it full on throttle, and what happened is the way the engine torqued back, it just separated the connector a little bit. Car shut off like I had turned the key off. And I actually stumbled onto the problem by like bumping it and the car turning back on. It was really wild. So I would first check that barrel connector and make sure that it's cool and tight. You could also disconnect it and look both ends, make sure there's no corrosion on the pins. Ground issues are notoriously problematic with changes in temperature. That would be another thing I'd want to look at. Engine ground, battery ground, chassis ground, all that stuff. Look, make sure your grounds are good. On that car, the oxygen sensor wires are really good about breaking right at the connector. So if you're standing in front of the engine compartment and you look on the passenger side behind the engine and down low, just like right above where the axle would be, you'll see the two connectors for the oxygen sensors. In fact, you replaced one of them, so you know where the connector is that I'm talking about. The black one, at least on US cars, the black one is front O2, the brown one is rear O2. Disconnect that, look at the connections, make sure they're good. Give the wires a little tug as they come into the connector on the body, on the harness side, not on the O2 sensor side. I've seen a lot of those where they look okay, but as soon as you tug that wire at all, you actually pull it out of the seal because it broke where the crimp is for the little pin end of it on inside of that connector. So really, really look at that hard. Look at that airflow meter connector really hard too, but think about commonalities. Think about what's happening when you're coming to a stop. You're pushing the clutch in, you're loading and unloading the engine in different ways, right? So we want to also look for things like a vacuum leak. Maybe we have a vacuum leak that as the engine torques back and forth, it's worse when it's hot, that a vac line maybe is separating her a little bit. We got to think about what's happening to the car when it's in the situation where it's failing. And for you, it seems like it's a constant coming to a stop. Start with those things. I think you're going to end up finding it. My gut says it's that barrel connector. Of course, without looking at it, it's a complete guess. But I would start there because those are commonality things. It'll make the engine do weird stuff. There is a likelihood of a worn out camshaft, and that's causing your cam and airflow meter problem. Timing is probably not as likely because you don't have any kind of timing fault really, because I think that's a short to positive code. But if that chain is stretched enough, maybe it doesn't store a fault. That's an old, I mean, gosh, guys, a Mark III is 20 years old at the newest. That's an old car, so it may not be quite as sensitive to some of the newer stuff. So if you don't find anything electrically, then my next step would be set up base timing and really see if it's in time exactly the way it's supposed to be. You use that little bar or whatever for timing marks and go from there. But my gut says it's electrical. Check the grounds, check that barrel connector and your wiring, and good luck. Hey, as always, guys, when you email me with these problems and you figure it out, drop that down in the comments and let everybody know, because this may help somebody out dealing with the exact same thing, and you got a resource right there. In fact, if you do that, I'll be sure to try and pin your comment up to the top or respond to my first comment, and I'll pin that, and then we can have multiple ones pinned for all the questions. All right, last one of the day is from Jason. Got a 2010 CC 2-liter 126K. Transmission likes to shift into neutral at very inopportune times. It's a DSG, so I don't imagine there's many opportune times. The transmission indicator flashes, check engine light comes on, turning the car off resets the malfunction, and the car will proceed to drive normally. Only once has it happened where the car continued to fault repeatedly. That was in rush hour traffic in the middle of a heavy rainstorm, going uphill both ways, and in the snow when it was a million below. I added the rest of that in case you guys couldn't tell. Thought this may have something to do with the temperature or moisture in general driving conditions, but about once a week and a half the car does this. We have kept up with factory fluid changes. VW wants to swap the transmission, but I can't help but feel that this may be easier or at least less expensive to remedy. Not really a car guy, but I can fix most things, but I want to know when to not mess with something. Any advice would be great. Okay, so Jason, I haven't ran into this, I've ran into this exact issue many times, never on a CC, but I have ran into it. So before we do anything, we need to not only check engine faults, but we need to check transmission faults. And you may or may not find something. If this happens again, or maybe when, first of all, don't shut the car off, okay? Because it seems like it reboots itself when you do that. So don't shut the car off. Try and get it to a VW dealership. It would be ideal if it's the one you've been going to, and say, hey, the light's on, it's doing it. Can you scan the car without shutting it off? And then we're going to pull engine faults and we're going to pull transmission faults. Honestly, I'd scan the whole car in case there's something else weird going on, because you may have a fault that's stored in the transmission and not in the engine, even though usually you get a read TCM fault in the engine computer when you have a transmission fault. So the thing I've seen cause this is, you kind of alluded to it, it's actually a faulty temperature sensor. And what was happening was the transmission was thinking it was overheating because the sensor wasn't reading correctly. And something that it would do to reduce the heat is it would kick the transmission into neutral. This was really common when the 09, I think, diesels first came out, and I did like 10 of those sensors. And you basically pull the cover off the transmission, you see the mechatronics unit. You can loosen the mechatronics unit and get to the sensor. I usually just took it out and set it down so that it wasn't resting on that arm that goes to the back of the transmission. And that fixed most of them. There also, as I'm saying this, I'm remembering there was more than one software update for that early vintage of DSG. I mean, the DSG had been around for a while, but you know, when it started coming in all the diesels and that, there was a couple of software updates. Hopefully they checked that before they told you needed a transmission, especially at the dealership. That may be something an indie shop doesn't know, but the dealership should definitely check that before quoting you what's probably a $7,000 transmission would be my guess. So I would go software first and make sure the software is up to date. Then I'd probably look at that temp sensor inside the transmission as the possible cause of failure. I really would, though, like to see a fault stored and something pointing to something before we just start dice throwing and shotgunning parts in, right? Loading up the parts cannon and launching parts at, especially when you're talking a mech unit for 2-3 grand or a transmission for 6, 7, 8, whatever they cost today. My guess is it's probably that temperature sensor failing based on what you described, based on the way it's behaving. Fluid change won't do anything for that. Really, the only thing I've seen is software updates fix it or new sensors fix it. Check that software first. You're out of federal emissions warranty for software unless you're in California, but I think even then you're still out. So you'll probably have to pay for it, but I would much rather pay $100 or $200 for a software update than pay like $1,000 or $800 for a temperature sensor, or again, 7 grand, whatever it costs for a whole new transmission. All right, guys, I'm gonna wrap it up there. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them down below. You like the video, hit the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and ding the bell. Thank you guys so much for watching, or thank you for listening to the podcast only, and I'll talk to you again next time.